The sun burned across the wild horizon like molten gold poured over a sea of dust. The wind carried whispers of tumbleweeds and the mournful creak of wagon wheels far in the distance. It was a lonely, brutal land, where the sand met stone, and only the strongest souls survived. Through this harsh wilderness rode a young woman named Clara Mayfield. Her dress was torn by the thorns of mesquite bushes, her boots caked with the red earth of the high plains. She had been traveling alone for 3 days, her horse gone, her canteen half empty, and her spirit trembling somewhere between fear and faith. Clara wasn't meant for this life of wandering. Once she had lived behind white fences and lace curtains in a small town nestled by the river. But fate had turned cruel. Bandits had raided the wagon train she rode with, scattering survivors to the winds. Since then, she had been running, from danger, from hunger, from the unknown. By noon that day, the land had changed. The ground became rocky, sharp, and treacherous. The old canyon called Devil's Spine stretched out before her, a labyrinth of red cliffs and boulders that could swallow a soul whole. Still she pressed on, for she believed the river ran beyond those cliffs, and where there was water, there was life. The heat shimmered like fire, her breath grew shallow. She climbed over a ridge, her hands bleeding from gripping jagged stones. Then it happened. Her foot slipped between 2 massive slabs of rock, wedging her leg tight. Panic surged through her. She tugged and twisted, but the more she struggled, the deeper the stones seemed to hold her. Time passed slowly, the sun crawling across the sky. Sweat stung her eyes, dust filled her throat, and still she could not move. The canyon mocked her with silence. Hawks circled above, patient and cruel. When the sun began to dip low, painting the cliffs in hues of blood and gold, Clara realized she might not see another dawn. Her mind drifted between past and present. Memories of her father's laughter, her mother's songs, the smell of wildflowers after spring rain. She thought of all she had lost, and all she might never find again. Then came the loneliness, the deep, endless kind that gnaws at the bones and steals the will to fight. As dusk settled, a faint sound broke through the stillness, the rhythmic thud of hooves against stone. Faint at first, then clearer. Someone was coming. The echo grew stronger, nearer. She lifted her head, straining to see through the haze of twilight. Out of the canyon's mouth rode a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, outlined in the dying light. A cowboy on a dark stallion. His coat fluttered in the wind, his hat low over his brow. He moved with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, the kind who had seen both the best and worst of men. Clara's heart pounded with a wild mix of fear and hope. Was he a savior, or another drifter with cruel intentions? Her voice was too weak to call out, so she simply prayed he would see her. The cowboy slowed his horse, his eyes scanning the canyon floor. The moment he spotted her trapped among the stones, he halted. Dust swirled around him. The last rays of sunlight caught the gleam of his belt buckle, the silver glint of his revolver. He dismounted, stepping closer, cautious yet deliberate. There was something in his manner, steady, silent, assured, that told Clara he had faced death before and lived to tell about it. As night began to fall, the desert came alive with strange noises, the cry of coyotes, the rustle of snakes, the sighing wind that whispered secrets only ghosts understood. The cowboy knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her trembling form, and for the first time that day, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. The stars began to bloom across the velvet sky. The moon rose, pale and watchful, over the canyon walls. Somewhere in that stillness, 2 fates had crossed. Hers, a desperate soul caught between stone and sorrow. His, a lone rider chasing nothing but the horizon. The Wild West had many tales of danger and love, but none began quite like this one. Because that night, under the cold desert moon, Clara Mayfield's life was about to change forever. Night had fully claimed the canyon by the time the cowboy dismounted. The moon poured its pale light over the land, silvering the jagged stones and deepening the shadows that clung to the cliffs. The wind had grown colder, whispering through the crevices like a ghostly hymn. The world seemed to hold its breath as the lone rider stepped toward the trapped woman. The cowboy's boots crunched softly against the gravel. Each step was slow, measured, carrying the weight of experience and caution. He could see her leg wedged cruelly between the stones, skin scraped raw, the fabric of her dress torn and dust-stained. She was barely conscious, her face pale beneath the flickering moonlight. He dropped to one knee beside her, examining the trap that held her fast. The stones were heavy, too heavy for one man to lift easily, but he did not falter. There was something in her frailty, in her helplessness against the cruel wilderness, that stirred an old, forgotten part of him, a part that once knew compassion before the desert hardened his heart. He looked around, scanning the canyon floor for loose rocks and leverage points. His movements were deliberate, guided by instinct. The canyon was quiet save for the occasional rustle of a lizard darting between rocks. Above them, the stars shimmered like 1,000 tiny lanterns, distant and cold. The cowboy placed his hands upon the stones, his muscles tightening as he began to push. The sound of shifting rock echoed in the canyon, a deep grinding rumble that seemed to awaken the desert itself. Dust rose into the air, coating his hands and face, but he did not stop. Bit by bit, he forced the stones apart, the sinews of his arms trembling with effort. When the stones finally gave way, Clara's body fell limp against the ground. Her leg was free, but twisted and bruised. The cowboy quickly tore a strip from his saddle blanket and bound her wound. His hands were rough, yet careful. Hands that had known violence but remembered gentleness. He lifted her easily, cradling her like a wounded bird, and carried her to a small clearing sheltered by boulders. There, he built a fire with dry brush, coaxing the flames to life against the wind. The orange glow flickered across his weathered face, revealing eyes that had seen too much loss and too little mercy. As the fire crackled, Clara stirred faintly, her breathing steadied. The cowboy poured water from his canteen into his palm and let her drink. He said nothing. Words had long lost their power for him. The desert had taught him that silence carried more truth than speech ever could. The night deepened, and the temperature dropped. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries slicing through the still air like blades. The cowboy added another log to the fire and pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. The flamelight danced upon the canyon walls, casting moving shadows that resembled spirits of the lost, and in that fragile light, a strange quiet settled over them, a peace that neither had felt in a long time. The cowboy sat beside her, staring into the fire. His mind wandered through the years, through gunfights and lonely roads, through faces that blurred together and names he no longer remembered. He was a man carved by hardship, driven by ghosts. Yet here, beside this stranger, something stirred in him again, something human. Clara's breathing softened into sleep. She was safe, at least for the night. The cowboy's horse shifted nearby, its dark silhouette steady against the stars. A faint breeze passed through, carrying the smell of smoke and sage. As the hours slipped away, the cowboy remained watchful. He did not sleep. Instead, he sat beneath the great expanse of stars, guarding her like a sentry of the wild. In the flickering firelight, her face seemed almost angelic, softened by exhaustion, yet touched by resilience. And as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold, he felt the quiet pull of fate tighten around them both. When Clara awoke, she would find herself no longer alone in the world of dust and danger. The stranger who had saved her was more than a passing shadow. He was the beginning of something neither could yet name. The sun rose higher, lighting the canyon floor. The cowboy stood, his figure outlined against the morning glow. The trail stretched endlessly before them, a road of both salvation and suffering. And though she did not yet know it, Clara's life, and his, were bound now, not by chance, but by the unyielding hand of destiny. For the desert had a way of forging bonds as unbreakable as the very stones that had once held her captive. Morning dawned like a slow awakening over the endless plains. A soft veil of mist hovered above the rocks, and the air was cool with the scent of mesquite and dust. The fire from the night before had burned down to embers, glowing faintly among the ashes. The canyon was quiet, almost holy in its stillness, as if the earth itself held its breath before another day began. Clara stirred beneath the cowboy's coat. The ache in her leg pulsed with dull pain, but she could move now, barely. Her body was weak, yet alive, and somewhere inside her heart, a new flicker of hope began to burn. The cowboy was already awake, his silhouette framed against the light of the rising sun. He moved with purpose, packing his gear, tightening the saddle straps, checking his rifle. Every motion was precise, the kind learned from a life where mistakes cost blood. He turned his gaze toward her. Though silent, his actions spoke for him. He lifted her gently, steadying her on her feet, but when she faltered, he caught her before she fell. He did not speak, but his steady hands told her everything, that she was safe, that he would not leave her to die in that wilderness. He helped her onto his horse, settling her carefully before mounting behind her. The stallion snorted and pawed the earth, eager to run. With a soft nudge, the cowboy guided the beast forward, and together they rode out of the canyon and into the sunlit wild. The trail stretched before them, miles of scorched earth, tumbleweed, and the whisper of distant storms. The desert wind tangled through Clara's hair as the world blurred past in shades of gold and red. The rhythmic thud of hooves echoed like a heartbeat, steady and strong, carrying them farther from the shadows of death. The cowboy rode with the ease of one who belonged to the land. He followed the faint marks of wagon wheels, the broken branches, the prints of men long gone. Every sign, every scent told him a story. The West spoke to him in ways no other man could understand. For hours they rode in silence. The sun climbed higher, burning through the morning haze. Clara's mind wandered between exhaustion and wonder. She watched the horizon bend and stretch endlessly, the line between heaven and earth shimmering in the heat. She thought of the man who had saved her, his calm strength, his wordless compassion, the mystery that lingered in his eyes. They stopped by noon near a shallow creek. The cowboy lifted her down and let her rest beneath the sparse shade of a mesquite tree. He filled a tin cup with water and set it beside her. Then he led his horse to drink, his movements deliberate and slow, always alert, always scanning the open land. The air shimmered with heat. Far in the distance, thunder rumbled faintly, echoing across the plains. A storm was building, a storm that promised both danger and life. As the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain and sage, the cowboy glanced toward the horizon. His eyes narrowed. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the hum of something approaching. Whether it was weather or trouble, he could not yet tell. Clara watched him with quiet awe. There was something untamed about him, something that belonged to the desert, as wild and unyielding as the land itself. Yet beneath that hardness was a soul shaped by loss, carrying invisible scars the world could not see. The storm came fast. The sky darkened, and the first drops of rain struck the dust with soft hissing sounds. Lightning split the sky, and the thunder that followed rolled across the plains like the growl of some ancient beast. The cowboy acted quickly, pulling the horse close and helping Clara back into the saddle. The wind howled, whipping sand into their faces as they rode toward a distant outcrop of rocks. Rain began to pour, heavy and relentless, turning the dry earth into rivers of mud. They reached shelter beneath a jutting overhang just as the storm reached its full fury. The rain drummed against the stone, and the air smelled of wet earth and electricity. The cowboy secured the horse, then built a small fire using dry wood he kept wrapped in oilskin. The flames flickered weakly at first, then grew strong, casting a warm glow against the cold gray world outside. Clara sat close to the fire, shivering beneath his coat. Her leg throbbed, her body trembling from exhaustion. Yet despite the pain, her heart was strangely calm. She was not alone anymore. The cowboy sat across from her, the firelight dancing over his face. In his silence there was something deeper than words, a kind of quiet understanding that bridged the space between two broken lives. The storm raged on, the world outside swallowed by water and thunder. Within that small circle of warmth and flame, time seemed to slow. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, Clara began to believe that survival might not be her only fate. Perhaps, somewhere in this wild and cruel land, she was meant to find more than just rescue. Perhaps she was meant to find something, someone to live for. As the rain softened and the night crept in, she watched the cowboy's steady figure beside the fire. His presence was as solid as the mountains, as constant as the stars that would soon return to the sky. And in that stillness, beneath the sound of fading rain, The bond between them, fragile but undeniable, began to take root. The morning after the storm carried a quiet that felt almost sacred. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth. The ground shimmered with puddles that reflected the pale light of dawn, and the distant mountains stood wrapped in mist like ancient guardians of the desert. The fire had long burned out, leaving only wisps of smoke curling into the gray sky. The cowboy sat motionless near the ashes, sharpening his knife with slow, even strokes. His expression was unreadable, carved from the same stone as the cliffs around them. Behind him, his horse grazed on the sparse wet grass, its breath steaming in the chill air. Clara slept a few feet away, wrapped in his coat, her breathing soft and uneven. Her hair was damp, clinging to her face, and her skin had regained a hint of color. The pain in her leg remained, but the swelling had eased. She was alive, saved by the hands of a stranger who spoke no words but carried a heart that had once known gentleness. As the sun climbed higher, the cowboy rose. His instincts stirred, the kind honed by years of surviving where law meant little and mercy meant less. Something in the air felt wrong, a silence too deep, a stillness too sharp. He scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing against the glare. Far to the east, where the plain stretched into infinity, a dust trail coiled into the sky like smoke. It was faint but unmistakable. Riders, perhaps 3, maybe more, moving fast. He knew that sight too well. Men who traveled in packs out here seldom came with good intentions. Outlaws hunted these lands, bandits, raiders, and those who thrived on the misery of others. It was a truth as old as the desert itself. He kicked dirt over the ashes of the fire, breaking camp in silence. When Clara stirred, he helped her to her feet, steadying her as she winced from the pain. There was no time for rest now. The storm had cleansed the land, but it had also made their tracks clear. Someone was following. They rode west, the horse moving at a steady pace across the damp earth. The sky cleared slowly, revealing an ocean of blue and drifting clouds. The wind carried the cry of distant hawks and the rustle of new grass bending beneath it. The world looked peaceful, but the cowboy's eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. Clara clung lightly to him, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and gratitude. Each mile they traveled pulled her farther from the terror of the canyon, yet deeper into the mystery of the man who had saved her. She did not know his name nor his past, only that danger seemed to follow wherever he went. By afternoon the sun returned in full fury. The earth steamed, and the scent of rain gave way to the sharp tang of dust. The trail became rough again, broken stone and thorny brush. The cowboy led the horse through narrow passes, staying close to the cliffs where the land offered cover. But the shadows followed. At times, he could hear them faintly, distant hoofbeats echoing across the plain. He didn't need to look back to know they were gaining ground. They reached a narrow ravine before dusk. The cowboy guided the horse into the shade and halted. He scanned the skyline again, his senses alive. The riders were closer now. He could feel them in his bones, the way the air seemed to tighten, the way the wind shifted. Trouble was coming. The land grew silent once more. Even the birds had gone quiet, as though the desert itself was holding its breath for what was to come. Clara felt it too. Fear stirred deep within her chest, yet beside it lived a strange, unspoken trust. She had seen this man fight the elements, face the wrath of storms, and carry her from the jaws of death. Whatever came next, she believed he would face it with the same unyielding strength. The first shot came just as the sun touched the rim of the horizon. The sound tore through the still air like lightning. The cowboy turned sharply, pulling the reins as the horse reared. Dust exploded around them, bullets biting into the stone. He spurred the horse forward, weaving through the narrow canyon, guiding it over loose rocks and sharp turns. Clara held tight, her heart hammering. Behind them the riders gave chase, dark shapes against the bleeding light of dusk. The sound of gunfire echoed, ricocheting between the cliffs. The air was thick with smoke and dust. The cowboy's eyes stayed fixed ahead, searching for any path that could offer escape. At last, the canyon opened into a wide basin ringed by cliffs. He drove the horse across it, heading toward a jagged outcrop of boulders that offered shelter. When they reached it, he pulled the reins and dismounted, helping Clara down. The horse snorted, wild-eyed and trembling. The cowboy's movements were swift and precise. He led her behind the rocks, his expression calm even as danger closed in. The riders' shadows appeared at the canyon's edge, their shapes distorted by the dying light. There were 4 of them now, maybe 5, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, rifles glinting in the sun's last glow. The air hung heavy with tension, the kind that comes before blood is spilled. Night began to fall. The first stars blinked above the darkening sky, and the cold crept in once more. The cowboy crouched low behind the rocks, waiting, his every sense sharpened. The desert had turned from refuge to battlefield in a heartbeat. Clara's breath trembled as she stared at the horizon. The men were drawing closer. She could hear their laughter carried on the wind, cruel, hungry, certain. And as the final light of day vanished behind the hills, the cowboy knew what had to be done. The past he had outrun was catching up, and the woman fate had thrown in his path was now bound to that reckoning. The desert had tested them before, but tonight it would decide whether they lived or died. The night had swallowed the desert whole. A red moon hung low in the sky, veiled in dust and shadow, casting an eerie light upon the barren land. The silence that followed the last gunshot was heavy, broken only by the restless wind slipping through the canyons. Behind the boulders, the cowboy crouched motionless, his hat low, his breathing steady. The glint of metal flashed in his hands as he checked his revolver, counting the rounds left. There weren't many. Across from him, Clara sat huddled in the darkness, her wounded legs stretched before her. Every pulse of pain reminded her how fragile her life had become, how the thin line between life and death could vanish with the pull of a trigger. The riders were close now. Their laughter had died away, replaced by the low murmur of men moving through shadow. The scrape of boots on stone, the clink of spurs, the hollow snort of tired horses, it all drew nearer. The cowboy could see them when the moonlight broke through the clouds. 5 figures, dark and dangerous, moving like wolves that had found their prey. He had known men like them once, greedy, heartless, ruled by the gun and the thrill of the chase. Perhaps once, long ago, he had even been one of them. But time and pain had carved him into something else, something harder, quieter, built for endurance instead of cruelty. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder. The land held its breath. The first outlaw stepped into the open, scanning the rocks with cold, predatory eyes. The cowboy's fingers flexed on the grip of his revolver. He waited. Timing was everything out here. One wrong move could mean the end for both of them. When the first man came within range, the silence broke. The gun's crack tore through the canyon like thunder, a flash of fire, a cloud of dust, and the first rider dropped. Chaos followed. The others shouted, their voices echoing against the cliffs, firing blindly into the darkness. Bullets struck stone, splintering sparks into the night. The cowboy moved with precision, never staying in one place long enough to be found. His shots were few, each one deliberate, each one meant to count. He knew this terrain, knew how to use the shadows and the rocks, but there were too many of them, and too few bullets in his gun. Clara pressed herself against the cold stone, trembling as the air filled with the metallic scent of gunfire. Every echo, every flash of light, burned into her mind like a memory that would never fade. She wanted to cry out, but fear kept her silent. The world had become a blur of noise, smoke, and death. The fight stretched on into the night, until the only sounds left were the moan of the wind and the soft, ragged breathing of those who remained. When the dust settled, 3 men lay motionless in the dirt. The remaining 2 turned their horses and fled into the darkness, swallowed by the canyon's vast emptiness. The cowboy waited a long while before moving. The moonlight glowed faintly on his face as he stood, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. His revolver hung loosely in his hand, the barrel still warm. The danger had passed, for now. Clara's heart pounded as he returned to her side. She could see the strain etched across his features, the weight of what he'd done. He knelt beside her, his movements careful and deliberate. In the pale light she saw something in his eyes, sorrow maybe, or the ghost of an old pain that words could never name. The desert was silent once more, but it was a silence born from loss. The bodies of the fallen lay scattered under the red moon, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound both mournful and alive. The cowboy cleaned his revolver with practiced ease, then turned his gaze to the horizon. The night was nearly over, and dawn would soon rise, painting the land anew. But rest was a luxury he could not afford. He knew those men had friends, and vengeance in the West never slept for long. He helped Clara to her feet, her body weak and trembling. Her gratitude was wordless, carried only in the way her fingers lingered against his arm. Together they mounted the weary horse and began to ride once more, leaving the canyon and its ghosts behind. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of shadow and gold. The first light of morning touched the horizon, soft and uncertain. Clara leaned against him, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her spirit strangely calm. Every step carried them farther from the danger behind, and closer to something unknown ahead. As the sky brightened, she watched the cowboy's silhouette against the rising sun. He was both savior and mystery, her protector, and yet a man lost in his own wilderness, the line between fate and choice blurred with each passing mile. By midday, the heat returned, and the land shimmered once again with that fierce, endless light. They found refuge beneath a cluster of mesquite trees beside a dry riverbed. The air was still, thick with dust, and the only sound was the slow, rhythmic breathing of their horse. The cowboy tended to Clara's wound again, washing it with the last of their water. His hands were steady, his eyes distant. Clara watched him in silence, knowing that he carried a story buried deeper than the scars on his skin. When the red sun began to set once more, the land turned to fire and shadow. The cowboy rose, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the world seemed to stretch into forever. Something waited out there, something more than danger, more than survival. Perhaps it was redemption, or perhaps it was love, hidden beneath the dust and the scars of a broken world. The sun rose slow and red over the wide western plains, spreading its light across a land washed clean by blood and storm. The earth shimmered with the pale fire of morning, and the wind carried the faint cry of distant hawks circling above the cliffs. The world looked new again, but for the two souls who rode through it, the weight of the past still lingered like dust upon their shoulders. The cowboy's horse moved at a slow, steady pace, its hooves sinking into the soft sand of the trail. Clara sat behind him, her arms wrapped gently around his waist, her cheek resting against his back. Her leg was bound tightly, still swollen and bruised, yet she no longer winced with every step. The pain was part of her now, just another scar the desert had written upon her body and soul. They had ridden through the night, away from the canyon, away from the men who hunted them. Now the horizon stretched wide and open, endless as the ocean, with nothing but dust, sky, and the sound of their own breathing. For the first time since fate had thrown them together, Clara felt a strange peace. The fear that once ruled her heart had softened into something deeper, quieter, an understanding of how fragile and sacred life could be in this land of hunger and dust. The cowboy had not spoken a single word since the fight, but he didn't need to. His silence had become a kind of language, one she had learned to hear in the rhythm of his movements, the calm of his eyes, and the way his presence steadied the world around her. By midday, the land began to change. The barren plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with sage and wildflowers. The sky shimmered a brilliant blue, and the air smelled faintly of grass and hope. They came upon an old homestead long abandoned, a crumbled cabin standing beneath a cluster of cottonwoods. Its roof sagged, its fence lay broken, but water still trickled from a nearby spring. The cowboy dismounted first, his boots crunching softly against the earth. He helped Clara down, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He led her to the shade of the trees and laid his coat beneath her so she could rest. Then, without a word, he began to gather wood, his every action slow and deliberate. The land around them was quiet, save for the soft murmur of wind through the leaves. A pair of quails darted across the grass, vanishing into the underbrush. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled faintly, a promise of rain that might never come. As he built the fire, Clara watched him in silence. She studied the curve of his shoulders, the way his hands moved with purpose and restraint. He was a man carved from solitude, shaped by the unforgiving rhythm of the wild. Yet beneath that hardened exterior, she sensed something gentle, something almost sacred that the desert had not been able to destroy. The flames caught, crackling softly in the still air. The cowboy sat across from her, staring into the fire, lost in thought. The light danced across his face, illuminating the faint lines of weariness etched by years of wandering. Clara realized then that he carried more than just his own pain. He carried the weight of every soul he couldn't save, every wrong he couldn't right. The hours passed slowly. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold. The world seemed to hold its breath as day gave way to evening. Clara felt the pull of sleep but fought against it, unwilling to let the moments slip away. Something about this day felt final, as though the land itself was preparing to close one chapter and open another. As the light faded, the cowboy rose. He walked toward the spring and stood there for a long time, watching the last rays of the sun shimmer on the water's surface. His reflection stared back, a man who had given everything to survive and asked for nothing in return. Clara followed him with her eyes, her heart heavy yet full. The silence between them said more than words ever could. He had saved her from death, carried her through fire and storm, and stood beside her when all hope had seemed lost. In doing so, he had given her more than life. He had given her a reason to believe again. The sky deepened into twilight. The first stars appeared, faint and distant. The fire crackled softly, throwing long shadows across the ground. The cowboy returned to her side, his gaze lingering on the horizon one last time. In that moment, something passed between them, unspoken, eternal. It was not the wild passion of youth, nor the fleeting tenderness of strangers bound by chance. It was something older, forged in pain, sacrifice, and the quiet understanding that love, in its purest form, does not need to be declared. It simply exists. The night grew cold. The cowboy placed another log on the fire, then sat close enough for the warmth to reach them both. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain and the faint cry of wolves far in the distance. Clara's eyes grew heavy. Her head rested against his shoulder, her heartbeat steady and calm. For the first time since the canyon, she slept without fear. The cowboy remained awake, staring into the fire as the stars wheeled slowly above. The land stretched endlessly before him, harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving. But for the first time in years, he did not feel alone. When dawn finally came, the sky blazed with gold. The cowboy stood, his coat draped across her shoulders, his hat low against the light. The road ahead waited, long and uncertain. But now, it was no longer a road of exile. It was a road of promise. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling warmth over the waking land, the two riders set out once more, bound not by chance or desperation, but by something deeper than the desert could ever swallow. Something the world could not name, but every soul in the West understood.